so pleased to have my colleague, my coworker, my friend, Richard Regan-Paul on the line with me. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today for this session.
Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, you're doing an awesome job. More importantly, I love working with you.
Oh, gee, thanks. I totally did not tell him to say that. I want to give a quick introduction to Richard. It's kind of hard to introduce someone I've known for so long, so I'll do my best. But Richard has been busy making people laugh for the last 35 years with work in improv, theater, and innovation. Richard has a career ranging from design thinking facilitation, being a manager at Innovation Lab, a service design project manager, and in so doing with all of those career titles, he has facilitated and run over 500 design thinking projects in healthcare, higher education, and private business. Richard serves as a faculty member at Creativity Effect and co-creates creativity edutainment workshops with us and has helped us consult at government, healthcare. He really has been a touch point at innovation journeys all across the range. Richard has performed, taught, devised, directed, and consulted hundreds of theatrical troupes, professional groups, and companies such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, Walt Disney World, the Orlando Shakespeare Festival, and Siemens. Richard's work on the silver screen also includes working with Warner Bros. Films, the film Geostorm, and Keeping Up with the Joneses. He is truly a well-rounded innovator, design thinker, and innovator. An improviser. I think I said innovator twice because you're just twice as good when it comes to that. So I will be co-presenting with Richard today as we go over today's third session, which are the three stealth deceptions that every leader makes that can kill innovation. So with that, let's begin today's session. I'm going to share my screen. Richard, let me know once that goes through and we will start today's session.
Sure thing. And we're up.
Okay. So quick little introduction as to Richard and myself. We heard about Richard. I am so pleased and so happy to be presenting with Richard today, and we hope that you can leave with some new learnings, some new insights. Anything you want to add, Richard, before we jump into today's content?
No, other than a lot of people think that innovation and creativity and leadership are very technical things, and there's lots of technical components to that, but there's also the critical thinking and the being able to look inside yourself as a leader and to understand the kind of choices that we have to make. Those are tough things to do. So we hope that everything that we share with you today is going to be helpful in that regard.
Absolutely. And so since we are at BTOES in Healthcare Live, Richard and I started our career together when we started working at the Florida Hospital Innovation Lab, which was an embedded design thinking innovation lab here in Orlando at Florida Hospital, which is then transferred branding into Advent Health. So at that innovation lab, Richard and I ran dozens of, Richard ran hundreds. I probably ran dozens because I joined a little after Richard. Design thinking projects focused on patient access, patient care, administrative problems, and any issues that could plague a hospital. So with that, we have found three stories in healthcare that really highlight these three stealth deceptions. Richard, do you want to give any more context or description of that innovation lab before we jump into those three deceptions?
Yeah, that innovation lab was created as a way to access information all across all lines and all hierarchies within an organization. So it was all about getting the front line and the C-suite together, because we knew that the answers to today's healthcare challenges are right there on the front lines, but the decision-making power lies in the C-suite. So we wanted to create a space where everyone in the organization had easy access and low barrier access to come in and co-create new solutions together to get answers where they need to come through. And for us, it was like about really trying to reach three different outcomes. One, fostering a culture of innovation. It was more than just doing design thinking projects. We wanted to make sure that people did develop into the second part, develop into design thinkers, that they themselves can innovate wherever they are, and no matter where they go in the company. And then finally, we wanted to help create sustainable and relevant solutions to healthcare. So the clinical projects were the best. They were the best.
Absolutely. And if you want to hear more about some of those projects that we ran, we'll have our contact information. We love sharing about innovative stories and successes with anyone in healthcare. So let's move into the 3 leadership deceptions that kill innovation. So on the screen, you can see we have 3 icons. The leftmost with the yellow background, that is the first and foremost leadership deception is the bias towards complexity. This is a bias that says the only value that I can add is to make things more complex, because simpler is never better. And this is a bias.
Then the next bias is the Atlas bias. This is the notion that leaders feel like that they have to sort of carry it all themselves. And while that may seem like a good notion, over time, it only burdens the leader, and it can cause great distrust when the work suffers.
And the third bias, the third stealth deception, is the safety bias. This is a bias of a fear of failure and a fear that to only progress, you have to make sure that every aspect has been thought through, every T has been dotted, every I has been dotted, every T has been crossed. Because if you make a failure, that is the worst case scenario. And in healthcare, that has very real life consequences. In healthcare, a failure could very much impact someone's life directly. So we have seen all 3 of these biases, all 3 of these deceptions that leaders have made in healthcare. And with that, so before we jump into the first story, Richard, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, there's obviously many different types of biases, but we're hoping in the stories today you'll get a sense and an idea that oftentimes leaders don't mean for poor results. In fact, many leaders want great things to happen, and they want to work in a way that that works with others. But when we get caught up with a bias, especially in the area of being a leader, you feel the pressure of being a leader, suddenly you just start to go into these levels of beliefs that there's no other way to handle something. And a lot of times these biases happen and the leader doesn't even understand that that's what they're doing, or that's the kind of thinking that they're evoking. So we're also hoping that in the stories today, we can share with you some ways you can stay aware of when it happens to you, and some ways that you can actually navigate the bias if and when it does happen to you.
So with that, we want to jump into our first stealth deception, and that is the complexity bias. With that, we have a story for you, and that is about Dr. Lederman.
Yeah, so Dr. Lederman was a healthcare executive, started out as an obstetrician, and eventually became a leader. And as an administrative leader of 3 different hospitals, he saw wonderful success. And because of his success, he got recognized in the system and was asked to move up and to take over the responsibility of 25 different hospitals, and including urgent cares and other care facilities that were within the network of then Florida Hospital, and then transitioning it to Advent Health. So as he went on to this work, he really wanted to focus on this idea of being more customer centric, and how to get the organization to be more nimble in moving for the consumer. So that's when he started looking at ways to change the way that they do business. And one area he wanted to change was the way leaders were managed, especially the higher level C-suite leaders, and then those leaders in the operational area, like the VPs and the CEOs. So he thought that, wow, this is such a big challenge. I'm going to need lots of kind of help. But that's when he started making some choices that made it more complex rather than make it a transparent and open process to innovate the management system. He started bringing in consultants and thought that, wow, rather than invite the managers to co-create with him new ways that they would manage the operations in delivering care to patients, he went to these consultants, and consultants started bringing in their sort of plans and ideas and approaches to change management. That's when they suggested that they create another layer of people to help facilitate the change. And so they hired or brought in internal employees, great people, great workers, but these people lacked the experience around clinical care, and many of these people were more on the administrative side, and so they didn't really understand operations. But they were tasked to help co-design sort of a change management system of the leadership. So as they continued this project, they did lots of committee meetings, and every time a plan was created, it had to go in front of steering, led by Dr. Lederman, and rejected, and they had to go back to the drawing board. After months and months of trying to figure out the right way to implement a change to leaders, those leaders who weren't a part of the process, it was often kept secret from them what the work was, and sometimes those leaders would have people in their downline trying to get the story, and even tried to kind of infiltrate some of these meetings to understand what was going on. It all culminated into a 2-day session with leaders, over 100 leaders on 2 days of Zoom calls, as this was all happening at the height of the pandemic. And the leaders were frustrated. They were really upset that a plan to change the way they operate their facilities and the way they work was just being put on them without any opportunity to weigh in. On top of that, they didn't understand who these facilitators were, other than they were people who were, some of them were subordinates of those leaders, trying to facilitate them to change. And then finally, what made things worse is that the reputation of Dr. Lederman, once a great leader, really started to wane, and he lost the trust of his close circle of leaders. So after 18 months of this project, and probably spending more than $3 million, no effects or discernible work that came out of that affected patient care. And ultimately, Dr. Lederman had to resign. And so the complexity bias, instead of simply going to people directly and inviting them into projects that were more manageable instead of wide-scale change, more iterative process, he thought we have to do it all at once, one big chunk, but without the word of the leader. So that's one way that the complexity bias can get a hold of anyone, taking on too much and not inviting others to co-create.
Absolutely. And we tell you these stories, which don't always have great endings, as a warning, as a almost like a fairy tale-esque message to say, like, these are the characteristics that we have seen that, if not corrected, if not adjusted, and really embracing the ambiguity of innovation, can really lead to downfall of certain leaders. Thank you for that story, Richard. The next bias we have, the next stealth deception, is the Atlas bias. And that Atlas bias can really be exemplified by Mrs. Rand. Mrs. Rand was a nurse, and she had a dream to be the best nurse manager she ever could be. Being a nurse, she had experience as nurse manager before, and she really saw how they did not always advocate for her in the way that she wanted. So she had this dream to be the best nurse manager and serve her nurses as best as possible. So one day when she got the promotion that she'd always wanted and she became the nurse manager that she'd always dreamed, she made a promise to her nurses that she would shoulder all of their burdens. She would be their advocate. She would be the gateway, the voice to leadership that advocated and created the space for her nurses. And this was a great sentiment, a great dream that became corrupted by her own desire to shoulder everything. By wanting to be the shoulders that her nurses stood upon, she herself got overwhelmed, just like we all can, because we're all human. And in so doing, this started to impact her work. It started to impact her delivery of her promises. It started to affect her day-to-day operations, and it ultimately affected her own personal life and work life. She started to deteriorate in productivity and quality. And this all came to a head when a nurse saw a very valid, very intense uh, issue at the unit that needed to be solved and told Mrs. Rand over and over again, but saw no movement. And so this nurse took it upon herself to go directly to leadership, directly to the CNO, and describe this issue. In so doing, Mrs. Rand felt like she was stabbed in the back. She felt that her own ability to be this nurse manager was taken away from her because she was skipped. She was looked over. And this caused Mrs. Rand to retaliate. This caused her to be defensive, and it caused her to lash out against not only the nurse that went behind her back, quote unquote, but against all the nurses on the unit. And this caused Mrs. Rand to deny vacation days, to create terrible work schedules for those nurses, and to bring her own personal feelings of inadequacy into the workplace. Because what Mrs. Rand, she saw her value taken away from her because she did not trust in the process. She did not trust her nurses to speak for themselves. She thought her only value was as the foundation for everyone. And this ultimately ended with the nurses leaving the unit. They could not trust Mrs. Rand as a nurse manager, and they left and found jobs at other units, other facilities. And I know this story because my wife was the nurse that went above and beyond Mrs. Rand, and she shared with me so many times that this nurse started in a great sentiment. She started in a place of true positive desire, but ultimately had a stranglehold on those nurses and was not allowing innovation to happen. Because for innovation to happen, you have to trust that you don't have all the answers. You have to trust that you aren't the only person that can support those around you. It's a really sad story, but it's a true story because from that point forward, Mrs. Rand lost the trust of those around her and of her leadership. And we say this because Mrs. Rand started in a really, really good spot. She had a desire to be the best nurse manager of all time. But in lacking trust and in lacking the ability to see those around her as being able to support her as well as her them, it didn't create the outcomes that those nurses needed. And this ultimately affected patient delivery. At the end of the day, it's not the nurses or even Mrs. Rand that's the victim here. It's the patient in the unit. It's the patients who are expecting nurses to be in their best, expecting those nurse managers to create a safe environment and to support those other nurses. And ultimately, it's the patient that is at the end point of these stories. Even in the first story with Dr. Lederman, it's the patient that experiences it. So with Mrs. Rand, she's a great example of the Atlas bias, that you don't have to be the sole supporter of those around you. You can support and you can be supported. So keep in mind, Mrs. Rand, when you're in a position where you can support, and think about, how can I trust those around me to help us all succeed? A rising tide raises all ships, and all those who support each other will rise together. So that is a very serious story that's really close to my heart about the Atlas bias. So moving forward with that, we have our third and final leadership deception, which is the safety bias. It's a bias that I think we can all experience, but I think is most critical in healthcare because it's such a risk averse market. So
Mhm.
Richard, how do we, what is this, the safety bias with Miss Funnel?
Well, the story begins with Miss Funnel, and uh, she was trying to find ways to help be more effective in work. And in some of the projects that she was overseeing, she started to develop this need, this desire to create checkpoints with her. So she started asking for reports and paperwork and documentation in the process. Um, and in the hopes of creating a safe check way to make sure that she's crossed her T's and dotted her I's, she started seeing results that she could not have predicted and she definitely did not want.
Exactly. So Miss Funnel, in so doing, to try to control the outcome, because for Miss Funnel, failure was not an option. And by not
Mm.
being an option, then that hindered the possibility of success. Because in innovation and anything with an ambiguous context, you'll never understand fully how what failure could look like and what success could look like. So with Miss Funnel, with her trying to cross her T's and dot her I's, she created more and more safety checks and process, so much so that the process was the focus because of the safety focus rather than the possible outcomes. So with Miss Funnel, she had a project that to train all the employees in the organization. She had a year project timeline. And because she was so focused on receiving reports, on controlling the possibility of failure, that deadline for the project came and she was not ready and she ultimately could not deliver the very thing that she was hoping to have. And by doing so, she herself created this outcome, this failure state that she was trying so hard to avoid. And by doing this, she had to come to her leadership and have that experience that she was most afraid of. She had to hear the words that I failed. But luckily for Miss Funnel, her leadership understood what needed to happen and they gave her grace and they forgave her and they gave her and they released her from this fear of failure. And from doing so, Miss Funnel was able then to trust the process, trust in herself, and accept that she couldn't control everything. And by doing so, she created a great process, and all of the employees became trained in design thinking. This is a consulting project that we helped with. All the employees became trained in design thinking, and this created a change in culture that increased Gallup scores and increased HCAP scores, and everyone benefited from it. And this all started when she released her fear of failure. So that is an example of the safety bias. So we've given you three biases, three self-deceptions that leadership can make focused in healthcare. These are also applicable to anywhere else in any other industry because leadership ultimately has to lead the forefront of innovation.
I have to say, Andy, that when you look at all three of these different biases, while they're all three different kinds of triggers, they all tend to lead toward the leader being isolated
Mm-hmm.
and thinking that there's no other way to solve something. And then the last thing they definitely think is, hey, I could trust others to help me work on this. So I just think that that's a really interesting when you look and compare all those three stories. Every time the leader is isolated and they feel like they don't have any other choice.
Absolutely. So, Richard, why does this happen? Why do these biases keep plaguing leaders in innovation culture, not only in healthcare, but everywhere else, but specifically in healthcare? Why does this keep happening?
Well, after again, all the years of study that we have done together and all of the innovation projects we've seen, it just all seems to come down to one thing, and that is fear. Fear seems to grip everyone, but oftentimes people don't know or what to call it, or they can't seem to identify when it's happening to them. And that's something that we have been really working on for many years, trying to figure that out.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we at Creativity Effect, actually, Dr. Tilstra, the founder of Creativity Effect, has coined a term for this type of fear, and that is the death line. The death line is two components. The first is death, which is really an uncertain outcome. The reason that it's a very intense metaphor, but we really want to stick to it because it really has impact. And that's first and foremost that there's a death line in all of us. And that's a fear of an uncertain outcome. And in so of responding to that fear, we create a line. We create a boundary of safety. And this death line can be applied to all three of those leadership deceptions. The first one, the complexity bias. Dr. Lederman had a fear that they had to create value, and the only way to do that was by inputting information over and over again. Instead of asking what's really going on, it's by inputting and making it more and more complex. And the closer they got to the outcome that they didn't want, the more irrational their behavior comes. And that's one thing about the death line that we really want to highlight. When you create that line, the closer and closer you come to that line, the more and more irrational your behavior comes. So how is that exemplified in the Atlas bias, Richard?
Well, with that Atlas bias, you definitely saw where the leader started making choices that really, again, I keep going to the idea of isolating themselves from trusting the process and trusting others to jump in there and to help co-create with them. And so we ultimately see that in the Atlas bias, that death line is if I don't get it done, no one will get it done. If that happens, we fail. So that really is like the burden of the Atlas bias, is that fear is that you can't trust anyone, but you're only setting yourself up for failure.
Absolutely. And then the safety bias, it's a fear of failure. And in healthcare, this is so real because in healthcare, the patient is ultimately in your care, and whatever you do will have direct and specific impacts on that patient. So the deadlines are very, very concrete in healthcare. And so with that, the uncertain outcome, it could be a patient's life. And that's the hard truth of it. And so in such a risk of adverse market, such as healthcare, innovation faces huge barriers because failure is just the name of the game when it comes to innovation. You can't go somewhere new without turning down a few wrong turns in a maze, right? You can't create something new without sculpting, without refining, without taking away and adding more. And so with Miss Funnel, she had a fear that if I fail, I am no longer worth the position that I'm in. And so this line that I have is I have to make sure everything is safe. And she became more and more inconsistent the closer and closer that death line came. It was specifically a dead line also.
Mm-hmm.
So these death lines, Dr. Tilstra has coined this term, and she has a book out on it. It's a phenomenal book. I've read it twice. We really suggest that everyone read it. And she gives a very, very simple way that we at Creativity Effect have used in almost all of our projects, a very simple way to overcome death lines. And that is in using the technique called the toll booth technique. And we truly believe that in these three examples of biases, maybe excluding the third one because there was a moment of this, but if every one of those people had used the toll booth technique, they could have created the outcomes that they wanted and not the ones that they were afraid of. So what is the toll booth technique, Richard?
So the toll booth technique happens in three very simple steps. One, if you're facing a moment and a challenge, you need to take a moment to pause, to stop from the work and take a step back so then you can breathe and allow yourself to go into what we call the mother of all questions, which is to ask ourselves, what is really going on here? Because if I start to ask that question, and I can actually have an idea of what might happen if I start to make or continue down this path of fear, this path of resistance, this path where I must not fail or I cannot trust anyone. If you practice the toll booth technique, you're really asking yourself, wow, if I continue down this path, um, this is what I'll pay for later on in the outcomes that I don't want. So rather than pay big and heavy costs in going down a path that will give you deleterious outcomes, take a moment to pause, breathe, and pay the toll booth in the moment of reflection. You pay very little as opposed to the costly payment you'll have to make after you've crossed that threshold and you've made choices that don't serve you, that don't serve the system, and more importantly, does not serve your consumer, your healthcare patient, and those families. So
Mm-hmm.
taking the time to pay with a little bit of pause and a little bit of reflection, some critical thinking before you go down a path that you would pay heavy fines.
Yeah, and you may think that this technique is simple, but in combating a complexity bias, we like to say that sometimes the simplest solutions, the simplest techniques have the most impact. Because
Mm-hmm.
I've done this before, where in my personal life and my working life, where if I can feel the motors of my brain starting to burn out, and I feel the friction start to lose, and I start to feel this sense of loss of control, I've used this technique, and it's truly powerful. How impactful it is, and how you can really then have a moment of clarity, and then act in an instant to make the right choice. So this toll booth technique is simple, but if you're in a place of leadership, if you're a nurse, if you're a doctor, if you're an administrator, if you're an executive, we truly believe that this is critical to being that leader that you need to be. It may be different than what you thought you needed to be, but it's what the moment needs from you. And we think that that's impossible to understand without a little bit of reflection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you're on that path, what they call path dependency, and you're only thinking one way. This actually just gives you a little bit of clarity to see where am I and where do I really need to go in this challenge.
Absolutely. So we want to start to wrap up our session by asking you a question, and you can put it in the chat, or if you want to just reflect internally. What is your go-to bias? What is your go-to of these three, or if you feel like there's a fourth one that we haven't shared today? What is your go-to bias? I'll start with sharing my own go-to bias, and that is the bias of the complexity bias. I have a thought that if I can just add more, that will always have positive returns. But just as we heard from Bill Wong earlier, if you keep adding a data set, if you keep adding data, it will eventually start having diminishing returns. Like eventually that will create a model that will become more confusing than more clear. So that's something that I have to combat. I have to combat that by thinking to myself, am I adding the right amount of value, or am I adding too much value? And in so doing, could I instead add clarity instead of adding value? So that's my experience with the complexity bias.
Mine is the Atlas bias. I've been on teams before, and we've taken on really heavy projects, and in moments of again, putting blinders on, didn't realize that I was trying to take on more than I could chew, in the idea that I was going to make things more effective and more efficient. I've had to learn that through the use of the toll booth technique, that taking a moment to pause and break from what I'm doing really makes me notice, hey, wow, there's an easier way of working here, and there's a more inviting way of getting things done with other people. I don't have to burden myself and go into really levels of martyrdom, and that is not a good place to be. You're not doing your best thinking, and you're not inviting others to do their best work with you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we want to have you also reflect on this, on what's one thing that you will do differently moving forward. We love to say that without reflection, there is no learning. So now that we've reflected a little bit, we've taken our time to pause and breathe and ask what's really going on here, and we've reflected on one of those biases that we may fall prey to. We ask, what's one thing you will do differently moving forward? It might be a toll booth technique check-in. It might be just using the wording of the biases. Like, am I falling prey to a complexity bias? Am I falling prey to Atlas bias or a safety bias? We think if you do just this simple reflection of the toll booth technique and asking yourself what's really going on here, and then thinking of what's one thing you'll do differently, you'll see some pretty drastic changes in your leadership, in your place of work, and even in your personal life.
Sometimes it might even be in that toll booth technique. The realization is, oh, you know what? I'm not engaging with enough people. I need more people to give me perspective around a challenge. So you may not be able to solve the challenge right away, but it's just creating that little moment of clarity. You really start to go into better fields of authentic leadership, stronger choices in how you collaborate, and not, again, putting yourself in the isolation of a leader. That's where leaders make their greatest mistakes, when they isolate themselves from others. So use that toll booth technique as often as you can. And because of it, I think I'm going to read that book again, just to make sure that I am refreshed. It's a really inspiring thing to know that I can have the insight to break away from thinking that really doesn't serve me or anyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful.
Absolutely. So we want to thank you for joining us today in our session. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to Richard or myself, or even Dr. Tilstra, the founder of Creativity Effect. That all of the stuff we're talking about came from her, and we helped build, but she's the true originator of all of this. So our emails are simple. It's just our first name, andy@creativityeffect.com. So with that, I'm going to stop showing my screen, and we have a few minutes left, Richard. If we feel that we have any other highlights or anything else we want to share, yeah, we have the space.
Yeah, I think when I think about the toll booth technique, there's more to the toll booth technique, especially those moments after the toll booth technique. So if you go into Dr. Tilstra's book, she talks about what she calls the 4 ACEs, and it's really about creating a way to deal with okay, now that I've gone through the toll booth, what are ways I can deal and continue to work in the situation with what she calls creating space, grace, setting the pace, and I always forget that fourth one.
So it's space, grace, pace, and place.
Place. There you go. Place. I think that's a really interesting one. The idea of like, hey, you know what? Maybe you need to go somewhere else, away from where you usually think. You don't normally think that environment always changes or determines the way you think and the way you problem solve. But if you're in the same environments and you're handling challenges in the same way in those same environments, chances are there's an interdependency there. And if you're in that environment, you're going to end up thinking in the same way. So he does suggest that find a place that is totally different, away from where you usually go. And that way it can evoke a new way of thinking just because you've changed the orientation of your environment. But I have found that to be true. There's one thing that we did a lot with the Innovation Lab, and that was what we called going on action learning field trips. And one idea was just to go out to another part of town that you hardly ever frequent and just drive or walk or ride a bike and look around and see what emerges for you. And be surprised, one, the things that you discover you didn't know about your town, but two, when you see something new or experience something new, suddenly a whole new level of thinking happens. And so that kind of fresh thinking always leads to stronger innovation, whether it's incremental or big systemic innovation. So you want to do things to inspire yourself. So whenever you have a chance, change your location so you can think differently.
Awesome. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's always a pleasure presenting with you. We are at the end of we're at the end of this third session. We have one more session after this with Vatsala Sadasavan, as we have their expert critical knowledge share with us. So again, we're going to go into a quick break. It's about 15 minutes. So if you go out, take a quick stretch break, and we'll be back here at the top of the hour. Again, Richard, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here, and we will see you in about 13 minutes. So go out, say hi to someone. We'll see you later. Thank you so much.